Pay attention to the woman in the white pharmacist's coat walking through the staff entrance of Hamad Medical Corporation at 10:55 p.m. Her name is Hiraya Ezekiel. She is 29 years old. A licensed pharmacist from Cebu, Philippines. Newlywed, married 11 months ago in a ceremony her mother still talks about. Her husband Marco dropped her off at the metro station 3 hours ago. He kissed her on the cheek. She didn't look back. Now watch the man entering through the side corridor at 11:10 p.m., Dr. Khalid Mansour. Senior cardiothoracic surgeon. 44 years old. They do not acknowledge each other in the corridor. They don't need to. They've done this before. 3 blocks away, a white Toyota Camry idles beneath a broken street lamp. Inside it, Marco Ezekiel has been watching the staff entrance for 15 minutes. He is an engineer. He is systematic. He is recording everything in his mind the way a man records things when he already knows the answer but cannot yet say it out loud. His phone last pings a cell tower at 11:47 p.m., 300 meters from the hospital's east parking structure. He is never seen again. Not that night. Not the following morning. Not for the 38 hours it takes his wife to report him missing. After finishing her shift, after taking the metro home, after showering, after sleeping, after eating breakfast. This is not a story about infidelity. It is a story about what happened after someone decided that a husband who knew too much was a problem that required a solution. And about the single maintenance worker who saw something in a parking structure at 12:15 a.m. and said nothing for 14 days, and what those 14 days cost. Pay attention to the woman in the white pharmacist's coat walking through the staff entrance of Hamad Medical Corporation at 10:55 p.m. Her name is Hiraya Ezekiel. She is 29 years old. A licensed pharmacist from Cebu, Philippines. Newlywed, married 11 months ago in a ceremony her mother still talks about. Her husband Marco dropped her off at the metro station 3 hours ago. He kissed her on the cheek. She didn't look back. Now watch the man entering through the side corridor at 11:10 p.m., Dr. Khalid Mansour. Senior cardiothoracic surgeon. 44 years old. They do not acknowledge each other in the corridor. They don't need to. They've done this before. 3 blocks away, a white Toyota Camry idles beneath a broken street lamp. Inside it, Marco Ezekiel has been watching the staff entrance for 15 minutes. He is an engineer. He is systematic. He is recording everything in his mind the way a man records things when he already knows the answer but cannot yet say it out loud. His phone last pings a cell tower at 11:47 p.m., 300 meters from the hospital's east parking structure. He is never seen again. Not that night. Not the following morning. Not for the 38 hours it takes his wife to report him missing. After finishing her shift, after taking the metro home, after showering, after sleeping, after eating breakfast. This is not a story about infidelity. It is a story about what happened after someone decided that a husband who knew too much was a problem that required a solution. And about the single maintenance worker who saw something in a parking structure at 12:15 a.m. and said nothing for 14 days, and what those 14 days cost. Pay attention to the wedding photograph on Marco Ezekiel's desk. Mahogany frame, the kind you buy to last. In it, Marco wears a barong Tagalog, hand-embroidered, commissioned by his mother months before the ceremony. Hiraya stands beside him in an ivory gown, her smile wide enough to compress her eyes into half-moons. The photo was taken at 6:47 p.m. on a Saturday in April at the Manila Diamond Hotel, at a reception attended by 210 guests. It has not moved from that desk in 11 months. Marco Aurelio Ezekiel is 37 years old. He was born in Batangas City, the only son of a schoolteacher mother and a retired seaman father. He studied civil engineering at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, graduated with academic distinction, and moved to Qatar in 2016 on a project contract he expected to last 18 months. He never left. The Gulf has a way of doing that to Filipino men in their late 20s. It offers salaries that restructure the entire geography of a person's ambitions. By the time Marco had been in Doha 3 years, he was a senior project engineer at Al Nasser Engineering Consultants, managing the structural design phase of a highway interchange system outside Lusail City. He supervised a team of 11. He sent money home every month. He called his mother every Sunday. He was building, in the quiet and methodical way of a man who plans for the long term, a life that could hold the weight he intended to place on it. Haraya Santos was born in Cebu City, the eldest of 4 siblings. Her father worked in the merchant marine. Her mother sold dried fish near the carbon market. She studied pharmacy at the Cebu Institute of Technology, passed the licensure examination on her first attempt, worked 3 years at a private hospital in Cebu, and applied through a recruitment agency to a position at Hamad Medical Corporation. She arrived in Qatar in March 2021. 16 months later, she met Marco at a Filipino expat gathering in West Bay. She was holding a plate of pancit and laughing at something someone had said. He noticed her the way people notice things they've been waiting to see without knowing it. He told this story at their reception, microphone in hand, the room warm and attentive. Everyone applauded. Their apartment in Al Wakra is on the 6th floor of a building called Jasmine Residence. 2 bedrooms. Shared car. Marco cooks on his evenings off grilled tilapia, sinigang from a powder packet they order in bulk from an online Filipino grocery. They have standing dinner plans with 2 other couples on alternating Fridays. Their WhatsApp group is called OFW Fridays. The last photo Marco posted in it shows 4 people eating grilled hamar fish on a rooftop terrace. Haraya is smiling. It was taken on January 5th. The night shift started that same month. But the story begins 3 months earlier than that. In October, Haraya Santos Ezekiel received a clinical query through HMC's internal messaging system. A post-surgical patient on Ward 7 had developed a mild interaction between 2 prescribed medications. The attending physician needed a pharmacist's review of the dosage adjustment. The query was routine, the kind of back and forth that moves through a large hospital's communication infrastructure dozens of times each day. Haraya reviewed the case file, documented a recommended adjustment, and sent her response through the system. The attending physician who had sent the query was Dr. Khalid Mansour. He replied the same afternoon with a note that said, simply, "Thank you. Exactly what I needed." It was professional and brief. Haraya filed it without thinking further about it. 2 days later, he sent another query. A different patient, a different medication, a similar interaction. Again, Haraya reviewed it. Again, her assessment was thorough. Again, he replied with a note, this one slightly longer, acknowledging the quality of her analysis, asking whether she had a background in cardiology pharmacology specifically. She replied that she had studied it as a secondary focus during her licensure preparation. He replied that it showed. The exchange ended there. It is impossible to identify, looking back, the precise message in which a clinical correspondence became something else. The shift was gradual and, in its early stages, structurally deniable. A query about medication extended one evening into a brief remark about the difficulty of night shift work, how the hospital changes character after midnight, how the corridors take on a different quality. Haraya, working her first rotation of overnight shifts, agreed. That agreement opened a door neither of them stepped through immediately. They stood at its threshold for 2 weeks, exchanging messages that were still technically professional but whose tone had begun to carry something additional. A warmth, a personal register, a quality of attention that clinical correspondence does not require. In November, Mansour asked, through the encrypted messaging application he had introduced into their communication with a brief and reasonable-sounding explanation about hospital privacy protocols, whether Haraya found the overnight work isolating. She said yes. She said that Marco was asleep by the time she returned home, and that there were hours between midnight and 4 a.m. that felt very long in a city that was still, after 2.5 years, not entirely hers. Mansour said he understood that feeling. He had been in Doha for 11 years, and there were still nights when the distance from Riyadh felt structural rather than geographical. This is how it starts in almost every case of this kind. Not with a dramatic decision but with the particular vulnerability of the small hours, the shared language of displacement, the discovery that someone in an adjacent corridor is awake at the same time you are and understands something about loneliness that the person asleep at home cannot fully access because they are asleep. It begins with recognition, and recognition, in the right conditions and at the wrong time, can become something that a person builds an entirely parallel life around before they have consciously decided to do so. By December, their conversations had left any professional pretense entirely. They talked about their childhoods, his in Riyadh, hers in Cebu, about their parents, about the specific texture of growing up in households where education was treated as a form of survival rather than aspiration, about what they had imagined their lives would look like at this age and how the reality compared, about what it meant to have built a good life on paper and still feel, at certain hours, that something essential was missing from it. Hiraya told herself, during these weeks, that this was friendship, that the hospital was large and her social world within it was limited, and that there was nothing unusual about two professional people finding common ground in the margins of a night shift. She told herself this the way people tell themselves manageable things when they can sense that the unmanageable version is closer to the truth. In early January, the conversations moved from the encrypted messaging app into the physical space of the hospital itself. Mansour suggested, and the word suggested is accurate, he did not instruct, he did not pressure, that they use one of the fourth-floor administrative conference rooms during the overlap of their schedules, which fell between midnight and 2 a.m. on 3 or 4 nights per week. He had access through his senior clinical clearance. The room was quiet, away from the ward rotations, and no one used it at that hour. Hiraya agreed. She agreed, and in agreeing, she crossed the line that she had been approaching for 3 months. She knew she was crossing it. The part of her that had been narrating this situation as friendship understood, in that moment, that the narrative was no longer viable. And so she began requesting permanent placement on the night shift rotation. She constructed the explanation she would give Marco, the maternity leave coverage, the differential pay, and she delivered it with the precise plausibility of someone who has had time to think it through. Marco accepted it. He had no reason not to. They had been married for 8 months. He still believed the life he was inside was the life he thought it was. By the second week of January, the night shifts had a new shape. Hiraya clocked in at 10:55 p.m., worked the dispensary floor until midnight, and then, on the nights when Mansour was in the hospital for surgical consultations or post-operative reviews, moved to the fourth-floor conference room. They talked. They shared food sometimes, things he brought from the hospital canteen. They sat across a table in a locked room in the middle of the night and continued the conversation they had been having since October, now without the mediation of a screen. 3 nights a week. For some weeks. She showered when she got home. Every time. Before changing, before eating, before sleeping. A full shower at 4 a.m. with the exhaust fan running. Not because anything happened that required washing away in any physical sense, but because guilt, when you are a person who still has enough of a conscience to feel it, adheres to the skin in a way that is not rational but is, in the specific logic of 4 a.m., impossible to ignore. Marco, lying in the dark bedroom listening to the water run, was performing his own 4 a.m. logic. And his was not irrational either. His was exact. The first signal was the phone. Not that it disappeared, but that it changed its relationship to openness. Hiraya had always been a face-up, counter-left, mid-sentence phone person. In February, it began sleeping face-down. The screen lock timer shortened. Once, Marco reached for it to show her a restaurant listing, and she arrived from the hallway with a speed that did not match the casualness she applied to the moment. She took it gently, said nothing, slid it into her cardigan pocket. The transaction lasted 4 seconds. The significance lasted much longer. The second signal was the laptop. In February, a new password appeared on the login screen. When Marco mentioned it, she said she had reset it after suspecting a virus. She did not offer the new password. He did not ask. That mutual silence, him not asking, her not offering, was its own kind of conversation between two people who are both aware that a question is in the room but only one of them is ready to say it out loud. The third was the shower. The same shower, every 4 a.m., without exception, for 6 weeks. By the end of February, Marco Ezekiel had not confronted his wife, had not searched her phone, had not spoken to anyone. He is, by the consistent account of everyone who knows him, a man who processes internally until the weight becomes structural. His closest friend in Qatar, a fellow engineer named Raul Escobar, would later say that Marco was the kind of person who needed to be completely certain before he said a word, because saying it out loud made it real, and making it real meant the life he had built around this woman had a different foundation than the one he had believed in. So he did not speak. He worked later. He began driving Hiraya to the metro on her shift nights. Not because she needed the ride. She had a transit card and the station was a 6-minute walk. But because the drive gave him a confirmed departure point. Something solid. In a life that had started to feel like load-bearing walls replaced, in the night, with something that looked identical but wasn't. On the last day of February, he opened the cellular data summary on their shared home Wi-Fi router. He was looking for nothing specific or telling himself that. What he found was specific. Haraya's device had connected consistently to a second network, an unidentified private hotspot, on 6 separate nights in February, beginning around 1:15 a.m. and disconnecting around 2:45 a.m. Not the hospital's general Wi-Fi. Someone's personal phone broadcasting a private signal somewhere inside that building, in the deep middle of the night. And Haraya's device finding it. The same signal. The same hours. 6 times. Marco memorized what he saw. He closed the router interface. He went to bed. He did not sleep. On the morning of March 3rd, he made coffee and made a decision. He was not the kind of man who could remain indefinitely in the hallway of his own life, listening to a shower he could not explain, staring at a ceiling he had memorized out of sleeplessness rather than peace. That evening, Haraya called a taxi. She didn't ask why Marco wasn't offering to drive her to the station. He didn't explain. At 10:20 p.m., he got into the white Camry alone. Marco Ezekiel parks on Alistical Road at 10:37 p.m., 3 blocks from the staff entrance of Hamad Medical Corporation. He chooses this distance deliberately, close enough to see the entrance clearly, far enough that his car, white and unremarkable, is simply another parked vehicle on a street where parked vehicles belong. He turns off the engine. He does not turn on music. He sits in the particular silence of a man who has been building toward a moment for 6 weeks and has now arrived at it and is not sure, despite all the arithmetic, that he actually wants what confirmation will cost him. The staff entrance is lit by a pair of overhead fixtures that cast a clean white light over the small plaza in front of it. Nurses come and go in clusters. A porter wheels a supply trolley across the entrance. An ambulance turns in at the service road, 200 meters north. It is a hospital at 11 in the evening. Busy in its specific overnight way, not frantic, but alive with the purposeful movement of people whose work does not stop at dark. At 10:55 p.m., Haraya walks through the staff entrance. Marco watches her go in. She is wearing her white coat over her street clothes, her ID badge clipped at the lapel. She moves with the familiarity of someone who has walked this threshold hundreds of times. She does not look left or right. She does not look toward Alistical Road. She goes through the door and she is gone. Marco sits with this for a moment. It is not, by itself, evidence of anything. She is a pharmacist. This is the hospital where she works. Walking through the staff entrance at 10:55 p.m. is exactly what she is supposed to be doing. He knows this. He also knows why he is sitting in this car. He waits. At 11:10 p.m., a vehicle pulls into the small staff parking bay adjacent to the entrance. A silver Mercedes, clean, the kind of car that belongs to a man who parks it without thinking about where it will be seen. The driver steps out. He is tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a light jacket over what appears to be a collared shirt. He is carrying nothing. He walks toward the entrance, but not toward the main staff door. He angles left, toward a narrower passage between the entrance plaza and the building's eastern face. A side corridor. A way in that does not route through the main staff lobby. Takes Marco a moment to understand what he is seeing. Not because the observation is complicated, but because the mind, when it is being given the thing it has been simultaneously dreading and seeking, slows down in a particular way. It requires the moment to repeat itself in internal playback before it accepts the information as real. The man uses a keycard on a panel Marco cannot see from this distance. The door opens. He enters without pausing, without looking around. He has done this before. The ease of the movement, unhurried, certain, the movement of someone who belongs exactly where they are, is the most damning part of it. Not guilt. Familiarity. Marco does not move for a long time. He sits in the Camry and watches the staff entrance, which has returned to its ordinary rhythm. Nurses. A porter. The ambulance coming back out now, empty. The white light over the door. The completely ordinary surface of a place where something that has been destroying his marriage for 5 months is happening right now, one building away, behind walls he cannot see through. He picks up his phone at 11:31 p.m. He opens WhatsApp. He finds Raul's name. He types, "Can we talk tomorrow? Something's going on." He sends it. He puts the phone back on the seat. He sits for another 11 minutes. What Marco Ezequiel does in those 11 minutes is not recoverable in full. There is no record, no account from him, no witness. What investigators would later piece together from his phone's location data, from the hospital's partial camera records that survived the system fault, and from Marco's own fragmented account, given months later from a hospital bed in Alcor, is this. At some point between 11:31 p.m. and 11:47 p.m., he got out of the Camry. He left the car on Alistical Road beneath the broken street lamp. He walked toward the hospital. He did not go to the main entrance. He walked along the building's eastern face, toward the side corridor he had watched Mansour use 16 minutes earlier. He found the passage. He tried the exterior door. It was locked from inside. He moved further along the building's perimeter, trying to understand the layout, looking for another point of entry or another angle of visibility. He came around the eastern face of the building and entered the grounds from the rear, through the vehicle access road that services the east parking structure. At 11:47 p.m., his phone connected to a cell tower 300 meters from the east parking structure's entrance. That was its last transmission. Not because the battery died. Not because he turned it off. Because someone took it from him and powered it off deliberately, and then placed it inside the kind of bag designed to prevent it from being located by the people who would, by morning, be looking for it. Marco Ezequiel walked into the east parking structure because he was trying to find a window, an angle, a way to see what was happening inside his wife's night shift. He was an engineer who believed that if he got close enough to a problem and looked at it from the right position, its structure would become visible. He was right about everything except one thing. He had not calculated for the possibility that they already knew he was coming. At 9:52 p.m., an hour and 55 minutes before his phone went dark, Haraya had sent a message to a prepaid phone registered to Mansour. He left earlier than normal. I don't know where he went. That message was read at 10:04 p.m. 6 minutes before Mansour pulled into the staff parking bay. Long enough for a phone call to be made. Long enough for a vehicle to be dispatched. Long enough for a door to be left unlocked in a parking structure where the cameras, as of 11:43 p.m., were no longer recording. At 12:15 a.m., a maintenance worker named Faris Al-Saladi was walking through the east parking structure and saw two men supporting a third man into the rear seat of a dark gray Lexus. The third man made a sound, low, involuntary, the sound of someone who was present enough to register what was happening but not present enough to stop it. The car exited through the south ramp. The parking structure was quiet again. Haraya Ezequiel finished her night shift at 7 a.m. She took the metro home. She showered. She slept. She ate breakfast. At 2:17 p.m. on March 5, 38 hours after Marco's phone went dark 3 blocks from the hospital, she called the Qatar police and reported her husband missing. She told the duty officer that Marco had been under significant stress. She used the word unstable twice. She mentioned a note he had left. She said she had thrown it away. She described a marriage in difficulty, a husband who had been emotionally erratic in recent weeks, a situation that might amount to a man who had needed to step away for a period of time. She said this to a duty officer who had no reason, at that moment, to look at the woman across the desk and see anything other than a worried wife. The note was never found. No forensic evidence of its existence was recovered from the apartment. The duty officer filed a standard missing person report. Marco Aurelio Ezequiel, Filipino national, 37, civil engineer. Possible voluntary departure. Referred to the Expatriate Affairs Unit for follow-up. The case file was thin. The case was not. It would take a detective named Hind Almari, a camera log with a suspicious timestamp, and a maintenance worker's 14-day burden of silence to begin understanding what had actually been built, quietly over 5 months, in a locked room on the 4th floor of a hospital, and what it had ultimately required to keep it hidden. The investigation was 3 days old. The architecture of the cover-up was 5 months old. and Marco Ezekiel had been somewhere in this city, in an unknown condition, since the moment the camera lights in the east parking structure went dark. The distance between those two facts, between the thinness of the initial report and the depth of what had actually happened, was the space that Almari would spend the next 7 weeks crossing, one document at a time, one warrant at a time, one carefully underlined sentence at a time. She would cross it, but not quickly, and not without cost. Pay attention to the man who almost didn't come forward. Faris al-Saladi is 41 years old. He was born in Al-Khor, on the northeastern coast of Qatar, the third of 5 sons of a fisherman who worked the same waters his father had worked before him. Faris did not go to university. He attended a vocational institute in Doha, earned his facilities management certification, and has worked in building services for 19 years, the last 7 under contract with Gulf Facilities Management, which holds the outsourced maintenance agreement for Hamad Medical Corporation's general infrastructure. He earns a wage that is sufficient, not comfortable. He has a wife, 3 children between the ages of 7 and 14, and a mother-in-law living in the same house whose medical expenses account for a meaningful portion of every month's budget. His contract with Gulf Facilities comes up for renewal in July. He has never missed a renewal. He has never given anyone a reason to miss it on his behalf. On the night of March 3rd, Faris was performing a routine check of the east parking structure's lower-level utility conduits, a task that appears on his weekly schedule every Tuesday between midnight and 2 a.m. He had his clipboard, his flashlight, his access card. He entered through the stairwell at 12:11 a.m. and was walking toward the south ramp when he saw them. 2 men. A third between them. The third man was not walking, he was being managed. His feet were moving in the incomplete, uncoordinated way of someone whose body is present but whose direction of travel has been decided by someone else. His arms were held at the elbows. His head was angled forward, chin toward chest, the posture of a person in the early stages of sedation or profound shock. The 2 men beside him moved with what Faris would later describe, in testimony, as practiced efficiency, the way you handle something you've handled before. They were not panicked. They were not rushing. They were completing a task. Faris slowed. He watched. The 3 men reached a dark gray Lexus parked near the south exit. The rear door was opened from the outside. The third man was placed into the rear seat. Just before the door closed, the man made a sound. Low and involuntary, the sound of someone surfacing briefly from deep water before going under again. The door closed. The Lexus exited through the south ramp. The parking structure returned to the specific emptiness of 12:15 a.m. Faris stood where he was for approximately 4 minutes. He ran the obvious interpretation first. A medical emergency, a patient brought to the wrong level, hospital staff correcting the situation. He held that interpretation as long as it was structurally viable. Then he let it go because the sound the man had made was not the sound of a patient being transferred. It was the sound of a man who could not ask for help but who was still, somewhere underneath whatever had been done to him, trying. He went to the utility room. He completed his maintenance check. He went home at 6:30 a.m. He told himself, during the 40-minute drive north to Al-Khor, that he had probably misread the situation. That the men had been hospital security, porters, clinical staff. That in a facility that handles thousands of patients per week, there are 1,000 variations of what a person being moved from one place to another can look like, and that most of them are medical and none of them are his concern. He told himself these things for 4 days, then for 5, then for 9. On March 8th, a notice appeared in the HMC contractor communication system requesting that any personnel present near the east parking structure between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. on the night of March 3rd contact hospital security to assist with a routine facility review. The notice was brief and administrative. The language was carefully neutral. Faris read it on the locker room tablet during his morning briefing. He read it twice. He did not respond. On March 12th, 9 days after the parking structure, for days after the notice, a Filipino colleague in hospital housekeeping mentioned during a shared break that a Filipino man had gone missing and that his wife worked in the HMC pharmacy. The colleague had heard it from someone in nursing. It was the kind of information that moves through a large institution's migrant worker community with particular speed, Because when someone from your community disappears in a country where your legal status depends on continued employment and your contract is the only thing standing between your family and a deportation order, that information becomes personal regardless of whether you know the individual. Ferris went home that evening and opened Facebook. He found the post Raul Escobar had shared, a photograph of Marco Ezequiel, a name, a description, a plea. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He tried to reconstruct what he had seen in the parking structure against what he was seeing on his phone screen. The man in the photograph was wearing a gray button-down shirt. The man in the parking structure had been wearing. He could not be certain. The lighting was partial. He had seen the situation for less than 90 seconds total. He could be wrong. He told himself he could be wrong. He went to sleep. He woke up. He went back to work. He was not wrong, and some part of him had known that since 12:15 a.m. on March 4th, but knowing a thing and acting on it are separated, in some circumstances, by a distance that is not measured in facts. It is measured in risk, in the calculation of what you can afford to lose, in the specific arithmetic of a contract worker in a foreign country who has a mother-in-law's medical bills and a renewal coming in July and has spent 19 years building a life that requires he not become the kind of person who causes institutional problems. He held it for 14 days. He will carry the specific weight of those 14 days for much longer than that. He has said so, in the limited way he speaks about what happened, on the single occasion he agreed to discuss it with a consular official. Not regret in the soft sense. Something more structural. The knowledge that for 14 days, Marco Ezequiel was in a room somewhere, and Ferris knew something that might have found him sooner, and chose the arithmetic of his own survival instead. On March 18th, Ferris al-Saladi drove to the Philippine embassy in Doha. He did not go to the Qatar police. This was not an oversight. A contract worker on a sponsored visa in Qatar has a very precise calculation to perform when deciding who to trust with dangerous information about events at the institution that employs him. The calculation pointed toward a consular official rather than a police investigator, because a consular official's job is to protect him, and a police investigator's first obligation is to the case. Ferris understood this distinction with the clarity of a man who has spent 2 decades navigating institutional systems from the bottom. He asked to speak with someone privately. He was given a meeting with Marjorie Santos Villanueva, the labor and employment attaché, 6 years in Qatar, who had handled enough OFW cases in this city to know, within 4 minutes of Ferris beginning to speak, that what she was hearing was not a labor complaint. She asked him to write nothing down yet. She called Detective Sergeant Hind Almari directly from her desk, with Ferris still seated across from her. Almari arrived at the embassy in 40 minutes. Ferris gave his statement in Arabic slowly and completely. He described the parking structure, the 2 men, the time, the vehicle, the sound the third man made just before the car door closed. He described the Lexus as dark, gray or possibly dark blue, large body, Japanese manufacturer, tinted rear windows. He could not provide a plate number. It had not occurred to him, at 12:15 a.m. on what he had believed was an ordinary night, to look for one. Almari asked him one question after the statement was complete. In your judgment, not your explanation of what it might have been, but your actual judgment, what was happening to that man? Ferris was quiet for a moment. Then he said in Arabic, he was not going where he wanted to go. Almari returned to the CID and pulled every piece of CCTV documentation she had received from the hospital. The parking structure cameras were offline for the critical window. She already knew this. But there was a camera she had not yet requested, because until this moment she had not known exactly where to look. The Ashkal Public Works Authority operates traffic monitoring cameras on major road junctions throughout Doha. One of those cameras is positioned at the intersection of Al Istiqlal Road and the hospital's South Service Road, a junction that lies outside the hospital compound, outside HMC's jurisdiction, outside the reach of anyone who had spent the night managing what could and could not be recorded on hospital property. Almari filed the Ashkal data request at 4:30 p.m. on March 18th. The footage arrived 2 days later. The South Service Road camera had captured, at 12:17 a.m. on March 4th, a dark gray Lexus LX turning left from the hospital's south exit ramp onto Al Istiqlal Road. The rear plate was partially visible in a single frame. 3 characters, 206. Almari ran the partial plate against the vehicle registry database, filtered to dark gray Lexus LX models registered in Qatar. 11 results. Cross-referenced by model year and registration date. 4. One of the 4 was registered to Marhaba Gulf Logistics FZE. Registered agent, Al-Rashidi and Partners. She typed the name of the law firm into her case management system and ran it against every document in the Ezekiel investigation. 1 hit. Her own interview summary from March 15th. The personal affairs firm of record for Dr. Khalid Mansour. She printed the vehicle registration. She printed the Ashkel footage frame. She placed them side by side on her desk. She looked at them for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the head of the Serious Crimes Unit. She told him she needed an arrest warrant authorization, a vehicle search warrant, a corporate registry disclosure order, and advice on how to proceed against a senior physician with documented connections to the ministry level. The line was quiet for a moment. "Send me what you have," he said. "Everything." She sent it at 6:47 p.m. The 9 days that followed would be the most procedurally demanding of the investigation, not because the evidence was weak, but because the evidence was pointing directly at a man whose institutional position had been carefully constructed to make pointing at him as costly as possible. Almari understood this. She did not rush. She built. Pay attention to the woman sitting across the interview table at the Criminal Investigations Department facility on the morning of March 22nd. Hiraya Ezekiel is wearing a pale blue blouse. Her hair is pulled back. She has brought a small bottle of water, which she holds in both hands without drinking. A private attorney sits to her left, a lawyer whose firm has, according to a sidebar notation Almari's colleague will add to the case file the following week, represented Hamad Medical Corporation in 2 previous employment dispute proceedings. This is not a voluntary interview. Hiraya received a formal summons at 7 a.m. It is her second interview with investigators. The first, conducted on March 5th at Al-Wakra police station, was classified as a missing person intake. This morning's session carries a different classification, and the first document Hiraya sees when she sits down is the reclassification form Almari places at the center of the table. Reclassification, suspicious disappearance, potential criminal investigation. Printed in Arabic and English, so there is no room for a translation dispute. Hiraya's lawyer asks for clarification. Almari explains, without raising her voice, that new evidence has been received, and that the interview is being conducted under formal investigative protocol. The lawyer notes his objection to the pace of the reclassification. Almari thanks him for the note and opens her folder. The interview runs for 3 hours and 11 minutes. What follows are its most significant movements. Almari begins with administrative confirmation, identity, employment status, length of residence in Qatar, the relationship between Hiraya and Marco Ezekiel, the date of their marriage, the address of the Al-Wakra apartment. It is slow and deliberate, and it is designed to establish a baseline, speech rhythm, eye contact, the specific architecture of Hiraya's composure, before any of the weight-bearing questions arrive. Hiraya answers cleanly. Her voice is level. Her answers are notably short. Short answers are a defense mechanism when you don't know what the other person already knows. Long answers expose the structure of a story. Hiraya gives short answers. Almari moves to the timeline of March 3rd. She asks Hiraya to walk through the day. Hiraya does. Woke at noon, ate, prepared for her shift, took a taxi to the metro station, arrived at the hospital at 10:50 p.m., clocked in at 10:55. She worked her shift. She noticed, sometime during the night, that Marco had not sent his usual check-in message, but characterized this as unusual without being alarming. She took the metro home at approximately 7:15 a.m. on March 4th. She found a note on the kitchen counter. She slept. She ate breakfast. She called the police. Almari lets the account settle. Then she asks, "Did you attempt to contact Marco at any point during your shift?" Hiraya says she sent a message around midnight. Almari asks to see it. Hiraya unlocks her phone and shows a WhatsApp message sent at 12:04 a.m. "Still awake? Busy night here." Almari looks at the message. She notes the timestamp. Marco's phone went dark at 11:47 p.m. 17 minutes before Haraya sent a message to a number that was already, by that point, unreachable. Haraya did not call. She sent a single message, received no response, and continued her shift without further concern until morning. One message, Almari says, at midnight, and when you received no response, and then no response through the remaining 6 hours of your shift, and then no response on the metro home, you weren't concerned enough to call him. Haraya says she thought he was asleep. She says he sometimes silences his phone when he goes to bed early. Almari moves to the note. She asks Haraya to describe it again in full physical appearance, the handwriting, the content. Haraya repeats the description she gave on March 5th. A white piece of paper, Marco's handwriting, left on the kitchen counter, saying something about needing space and needing to think. She had read it, been confused by it, and thrown it away because she believed it was a private communication and had not yet understood that its significance would extend beyond the two of them. Almari places a document on the table. It is a printed summary of the forensic sweep conducted on the Al-Wakr apartment on March 8th. She points to a single line, no paper fragments, handwriting samples, or residue consistent with a disposed handwritten note recovered from kitchen waste receptacle, secondary waste collection points, or building refuse area. She lets Haraya read it. The lawyer says that absence of forensic evidence does not constitute evidence the note did not exist. Almari agrees without argument and moves on. She asks about Haraya's professional relationship with Dr. Khalid Mansour. Haraya repeats what she told the duty officer on March 5th. A senior physician with whom she interacted in the standard course of pharmaceutical dispensing for surgical patients. Professional. Limited. Appropriate to the roles. Almari places a second document on the table. It is a printed summary of communications extracted from an encrypted messaging application on Haraya's personal device. Data obtained under a digital forensics warrant executed on March 19th, opposed by Haraya's lawyer and upheld by the court within 24 hours. The summary shows 847 messages exchanged between Haraya's device and a second device across a period of approximately 5 months. The second device was registered to a prepaid SIM purchased at a telecommunications outlet in the Villaggio Mall. The SIM was activated 2 days after purchase. Its purchase, confirmed on mall CCTV, shows Dr. Khalid Mansour at the point-of-sale terminal. Almari does not read from the messages. She places the summary on the table and waits. Haraya looks at the document. Her hands tighten around the water bottle. She does not speak for 14 seconds. Almari notes this in her report because she has a practice of timing silences. She learned early in her career that the duration of a silence after a significant document is placed in front of someone tells you something that no answer can fully replicate. Haraya's lawyer leans in and speaks to her quietly. Haraya nods. Then she says, in a voice that is subtly different from the one she has been using for the past 90 minutes, lower, slightly less managed. We were friends. For 5 months. Almari asks, yes. 847 messages. We talked. About work. About life here. It can be lonely working overnight shifts. The hospital is large. There is not always someone to talk to. Did you talk about Marco? A pause. Sometimes. Did Dr. Mansour know that Marco had been following you? In the days before March 3rd. Haraya's lawyer says his client is not required to answer speculative questions. Almari does not acknowledge the intervention. She keeps her eyes on Haraya. I'm asking, she says, with the particular quietness of someone who does not need to raise their voice to occupy a room entirely. Because the east parking structure cameras at Hamad Medical Corporation were switched off at 11:43 p.m. on March 3rd. That is 4 minutes before Marco's phone went dark in that structure. The cameras were not switched off by a fault. We have the server log. Someone made a deliberate decision to interrupt that system at 11:43 p.m., knowing that a specific person would be in that structure within minutes. The only way anyone inside that hospital could have known Marco was outside at 11:43 p.m. is if someone told them. Or showed them. The room is very quiet. Almari places the third document on the table. A single printed message, extracted from the encrypted communications log, timestamped 9:52 p.m. on March 3rd, sent from Hiraya's device to the prepaid SIM. He left earlier than normal. I don't know where he went. Below it, a second line. The message log shows that text was read at 10:04 p.m., 14 minutes before Dr. Khalid Mansour arrived at the hospital through the side corridor. Hiraya does not look at the document for long. She looks at it the way you look at something you have been expecting to see and had hoped, despite all evidence, might not arrive. Her lawyer says they are done for the day, that his client will provide no further responses without a full review of disclosed evidence, and that they reserve all rights under Qatari criminal procedure. Almari acknowledges this. She closes her folder. She informs Hiraya, with the same level voice she has maintained for the entire 3 hours, that a travel prohibition order was placed on her residency status at 10 a.m. that morning, under Article 47 of the Criminal Procedure Code, and that she should make no attempt to leave the country pending the outcome of the investigation. Hiraya looks at the travel prohibition order for a moment without speaking. Her face, in Almari's recollection, written in her case notes 3 days later in that precise way she has of noting things that are not quite evidence but are too important to lose, shows something that is not fear and not grief and not guilt exactly. It is the expression of someone who has watched a door close that they believed, even at this late hour, was still fractionally open. The full extraction of the 847 messages will take another 9 days to complete. When the digital forensics team finishes, what the communications reveal is not friendship. It is a parallel operation, a 5-month record of Marco's behavior being observed, discussed, and managed. 14 messages reference him by name or by clear implication. 3 of those messages, sent across the 7 days before March 3rd, describe him in escalating terms, watching more than usual, asking questions not where he should be. And then, at 9:52 p.m. on March 3rd, the message that functions as a trigger: he left earlier than normal. I don't know where he went. That message was read at 10:04 p.m. by a man who was already on his way to the hospital. A man who, upon reading it, understood exactly what it meant. The husband was no longer at home, no longer at any known coordinate, and the operation that had been prepared for this contingency needed to be activated now. He arrived at the hospital's side corridor at 11:10 p.m. The cameras went dark at 11:43 p.m. Marco's phone went dark at 11:47 p.m. These are not coincidences. They are a sequence. And a sequence has a beginning, which means it has an author. Almari drives back to the CID building. She sits at her desk. She looks at the timeline she has been constructing since the first morning of this investigation, and she reads it once from beginning to end, the way you read a structure you've built to verify it will hold the weight you need to place on it. It holds. She picks up her phone and calls the Warren office. There are now 2 questions left. Where is the vehicle that carried Marco Ezekiel out of the east parking structure at 12:15 a.m.? And where, in whatever room, in whatever condition, is Marco Ezekiel? Both questions have answers. Finding them will require one more witness, one more warrant, and a forensic sweep of a warehouse on the eastern edge of the city that nobody has thought to look at yet. The next 72 hours will change everything that remains. Pay attention to the paper trail. Not because it is elegant, it isn't. It is bureaucratic and dense and requires 3 investigative agencies and 7 weeks to fully trace. But pay attention to it, because the architecture of concealment reveals itself the same way a building reveals structural failure. Gradually, under pressure, in fragments that appear unrelated until the moment they converge and the whole picture becomes undeniable. The dark gray Lexus LX registered to Marhaba Gulf Logistics FZE is located on March 24th in an industrial storage facility in the Ras Abu Fantas area, on the eastern periphery of Doha near the desalination plant. The facility is a converted warehouse rented under a 2-year commercial lease by a freight forwarding company whose listed directors include a Pakistani national who departed Qatar on a one-way ticket to Karachi on March 7th, 3 days after Marco's disappearance, and has not returned. The vehicle has been professionally cleaned. Forensic technicians from the CID's scientific laboratory spend 11 hours processing the interior under the direction of senior analyst Dr. Noor Al-Rashidi. What they recover is not abundant, but it is specific in the way that matters. From the rear passenger footwell, a partial synthetic fiber consistent with anti-static cable management strapping, the kind available at industrial supply outlets, used in improvised restraint scenarios because it does not break under tension and leaves minimal surface bruising when applied with padding. The fiber has been cleaned from every accessible surface but caught in the seam where the footwell carpet meets the door sill trim. Cleaning removes what the eye can reach. It does not remove what the seam keeps. From the interior handle of the rear passenger door, a partial fingerprint, left-hand index or middle finger, insufficient for a standalone database match. Preserved for comparative analysis against any future subject. From the cleaned surface of the trunk lining, trace quantities of midazolam, a benzodiazepine sedative used in clinical settings for procedural sedation and acute agitation management. A controlled substance in Qatar, dispensed under strict pharmaceutical regulation. Accessible, however, to personnel with clinical prescribing authority and access to a hospital's controlled substance dispensing system. And the forensic report notes this as a secondary access pathway without elaboration, to a licensed pharmacist working overnight shifts in the same institution's dispensary. Almari presents the findings to her supervisor at the CID's Serious Crimes Unit on March 26. She describes the midazolam trace as not a smoking gun but a smoking corridor. What it does is this. It places pharmaceutical-grade sedative material inside a vehicle registered to a shell company connected to the personal affairs law firm of a senior HMC surgeon who spent 5 months communicating covertly with the missing man's wife, who arrived at a hospital side entrance 14 minutes after receiving a message confirming the missing man's location was unknown, and whose documented alibi for the early hours of March 4th contains an unaccounted gap of more than an hour. Every element is connected to every other element. Nothing is coincidental. The question is no longer whether something happened. The question is who authorized it, who executed it, and who else was paid to stay quiet. Almari applies for the arrest warrant on March 27th. The application goes to the Attorney General's office. It is returned 4 days later with a request for additional supporting evidence before authorization will be considered. This is not procedurally unusual. But within the CID it carries a specific meaning when it happens in cases of this kind, cases involving individuals with institutional standing and family connections that extend into the government's professional architecture. Mansour's wife is the daughter of a former minister. Her father's name appears on a publicly archived advisory committee from several years prior. Qatar is a small country. Its professional networks are dense and often overlap with its political ones. Almari's supervisor describes this reality to her in a private conversation as a gravitational force you have to account for. He says it without apology. It is simply the terrain. Almari accounts for it. She does not reduce her approach or soften her documentation. She builds the case with more precision than she might otherwise need. Not because the standard of proof has changed, but because she understands that a case built against a man with this kind of institutional insulation must be structurally unassailable. Every element must hold. Every connection must be documentable. There can be no overreach, no assumptions presented as conclusions, no gap that a lawyer in an expensive suit can widen into reasonable doubt. While the warrant process navigates its atmosphere, the corporate investigation expands. Qatar's Financial Intelligence Unit is brought in to examine Marhaba Gulf Logistics FZE at the registry level. They find what investigators find inside shell companies designed purely for operational cover. No employees, no freight activity, no revenue from any legitimate source. But they do find transactions. Transfers from a private bank account in Bahrain into a Qatari account held in the name of a Bangladeshi national named Imtiaz Hossain. His residency permit lists his employer as Marhaba Gulf Logistics FZE, with the title of Logistics Supervisor. He has a second phone, purchased at the same Villaggio Mall telecommunications outlet where Mansour bought the prepaid SIM 2 days after that purchase. His call records show 3 outgoing calls on the night of March 3rd, between 10:30 p.m. and 11:15 p.m., to a number registered to an Emirati-registered private security contractor called Safeguard Peninsula Solutions, based in Abu Dhabi and listing its services as executive protection, asset management, and sensitive logistics coordination. Safeguard Peninsula Solutions has 2 documented clients in Qatar. One is a real estate development firm. The other, via a services agreement signed 4 months before Marco's disappearance, is Marhaba Gulf Logistics FZE. Imtiaz Hossein is located in Doha on April 2nd. He is placed under a travel prohibition and interviewed for 3 hours, during which he says nothing of substance. Then his lawyer requests a break. In the break, Hossein is shown the midazolam trace report, the fiber analysis findings, the partial fingerprint documentation, and the single frame from the Ashkel traffic camera showing the Lexus plate. His lawyer returns from the break and informs Al-Mari that his client would like to provide a revised statement. What Hossein tells investigators on the afternoon of April 2nd is the following. He was employed through the shell company to coordinate what he was told to understand as sensitive transport, the movement of individuals from one location to another without formal documentation. He received instructions through an encrypted platform. He did not know the identity of the person issuing those instructions. He knew only that payment arrived in cash, reliably, and that the instructions were always precise and always last minute. He had performed 3 such transports before March 3rd, twice involving individuals he understood to be under debt or contractual pressure, once involving circumstances he chose not to examine because the money was sufficient. On the night of March 3rd, instructions arrived at 10:22 p.m., 18 minutes after the prepaid SIM registered to Mansour had received Hiraya's 9:52 p.m. message. The instructions were specific. Vehicle to be positioned at the HMC East parking structure south ramp by 11:50 p.m. Person would be brought out. The person would already be sedated. Drive to the secondary facility in Ras Abu Fantas. Wait for further instructions. The further instructions never came. After 2 hours at the Ras Abu Fantas facility, a single-word message arrived through the encrypted platform. Disperse. Hossein parked the vehicle inside the warehouse, transferred to a second car, and left. He did not go into the back room. He did not ask what happened to the person he had transported. He made a deliberate decision not to know. Al-Mari asks him directly, "Was the person alive when you left the vehicle at Ras Abu Fantas?" Hossein is quiet for several seconds. Then, "He was breathing when I loaded him into the car. After that, I don't know. After that." Those 3 words. Al-Mari requests a second forensic sweep of the Ras Abu Fantas warehouse immediately. The first sweep had processed the vehicle and classified the warehouse's rear section as general storage. Hossein's statement changes the classification entirely. The second sweep goes in on April 4th. Behind a shelving unit stacked with empty freight crates, investigators find a door. Behind the door, a room, 12 feet by 14 feet, concrete walls, a single overhead light fitting, a sleeping bag on the floor, an empty plastic water bottle, a bucket in the corner, and anchored to the eastern wall, approximately 3 feet from the floor, a metal ring bolt with abrasion marks on the concrete beneath it. Marks consistent with the movement of a restrained person shifting position across an extended period of time. Marco Ezekiel is not in the room, but on the floor near the ring bolt, partially beneath the sleeping bag, forensics recovers a mobile phone. Huawei model. Screen cracked from impact along the upper right corner. Powered off. The IMEI number, when run against the telecommunications registry, matches the device registered to Marco Aurelio Ezekiel of Al Wakra, Doha. His phone did not go dark in a parking structure because someone placed it in a signal-blocking pouch. It went dark because someone removed it from him in that structure, powered it down deliberately, and carried it here. It has been sitting on the floor of a concrete room in a warehouse on the eastern edge of the city for 32 days while his mother has been lighting candles in Batangas, and Raul Escobar has been driving to police stations and embassies and back again, and Detective Sergeant Hind Al-Mari has been building a case wall by wall. His phone is here. Marco is not, which means he was moved, and which means, and Al-Mari holds this thought without releasing it too quickly, because hope in an investigation is not an emotion, it is a data point, and a data point requires verification, that someone made a decision at some point in those 32 days to move him rather than leave him. People who intend only one outcome do not move their subjects. They do not provide sleeping bags and water bottles. They do not return with food. Movement implies continuation. Continuation implies that somewhere, in whatever condition, Marco Ezekiel is still present in the world. The warrant for Mansour's arrest is authorized by the Attorney General on April 5th. The gravitational force has not disappeared. But the accumulated weight of the evidence, the shell company, the vehicle, the midazolam, the partial plate, the intercepted messages, the 9:52 p.m. trigger text, the IT security supervisor who will eventually testify that he received a direct instruction to interrupt the parking structure cameras that night, the Hossein statement, and the room in Ras Abu Fantas with the ring bolt and the phone on the floor, that weight has exceeded it. The warrant is granted. The arrest is scheduled for the morning of April 8th. Almari drives home that evening by a route she does not usually take. She passes the Jasmine Residence building in Al Wakra. She does not stop. She looks up at the 6th floor from the car. The windows are dark. The apartment has been sealed since the investigation's early days. The white Camry is no longer in the parking bay below it. Everything about the building looks the way ordinary buildings look at night. Closed, quiet, indifferent to the specific gravity of what happened inside it. She drives on. There are now two questions that remain, and they are the same question from different directions. The first, where is Marco Ezekiel? The second, is the answer one that still permits everything that comes next to mean something? She does not sleep particularly well that night. Not from fear. From the specific vigilance of a person who understands that the distance between the evidence she has built and the outcome she is working toward is still bridged by the most irreducible variable in any investigation, the condition of the person at its center. She will know in 72 hours. Pay attention to the man in the hospital bed in Ward 7B of Al Khor Hospital, on the northeastern coast of Qatar. He has been here for 38 days under a name that is not his own. He was admitted as an unidentified patient in the early hours of March 4th, presenting with sedative toxicity and blunt cranial trauma, brought in by two men who gave a name at the admissions desk, a name that does not appear in any national identity registry, paid 3 weeks of estimated costs in cash, and were never seen at the hospital again. The attending physician documented him as an unconscious adult male, approximate age mid to late 30s, no identification, no personal effects, no next of kin. The medical staff in Ward 7B have called him, among themselves, the quiet one. For the first 3 weeks, this was not a choice he was making. He was largely unresponsive, surfacing and submerging from the sedation damage in irregular intervals, his body processing what had been done to it with the slow, unglamorous labor of physical recovery. In the 2 weeks since he began to come back to himself, since his eyes started tracking movement, since he began taking water without assistance, since he started sitting upright for short periods and looking at the window with an expression the nurses described as someone learning to recognize ordinary things again, he has said very little. He has understood where he is. He has not, until the evening of April 9th, been willing to say his name. There is a Filipina nurse on the evening rotation in Ward 7B. Her name is Jocelyn Panganiban, and she has worked at Al Khor Hospital for 4 years. She is 34 years old, from Iloilo, and she has a photograph of her 2 children on the lanyard of her ID card because she is far enough from home that keeping their faces near her face matters. She has seen the missing persons notice for Marco Ezekiel, shared through the OFW community network in Qatar about 2 weeks earlier, but the patient in Ward 7B was admitted before the notice circulated, and her rotation does not always take her to that ward, and in a large hospital with a steady flow of patients, the connection between a face she passes in a corridor and a photograph on a community Facebook page is not a connection that forms automatically. It requires proximity. It requires a second look. On April 9th, Jocelyn is covering a colleague's shift. She enters Ward 7B for evening medication rounds. She looks at the man in the bed near the window, the quiet one, the unidentified patient, the man who has been in this room for 5 weeks without a name attached to him on the institutional record. She looks at him for a moment longer than the chart requires. There is something about his face, the particular angle of the jaw, the shape of his eyes even in their exhausted, unfocused state, that connects, without her being able to immediately say why, to something she has seen recently. Not in the hospital. Outside it. On a screen. She sets down his medication. She sits down in the chair beside his bed, which is not something nurses always have time to do but which she does now because something in her is insisting on it. She leans slightly forward, and she speaks to him not in Arabic, not in English, but in Tagalog. Quietly. Just his name, if he has one, and the question of whether he is from home. The man turns his head toward her. slowly, with the deliberateness of someone relearning the mechanics of voluntary movement. He looks at her. Something in his eyes changes, not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, but in the real and small way that recognition works when a person has been alone with no language for a very long time and suddenly hears something familiar. His lips move. His voice, when it comes, is barely there. Weeks of disuse and sedation have reduced it to something rough and fractional. But the word is clear. Marco, he says. Ezekiel. Jocelyn Panganiban goes to the nursing station and calls the Philippine embassy in Doha at 7:45 p.m. The duty officer answers. She tells him what she knows and what she suspects. The duty officer calls Detective Sergeant Hind Almari at 8 p.m. Almari is at her desk. She has been at her desk most of the evening. She picks up on the first ring. She arrives at Al-Khor Hospital at 10:15 p.m., accompanied by a CID colleague and the embassy's consular officer. She is taken to Ward 7B. She enters the room quietly. The overhead light is off. There is only the low glow of the bedside lamp. Marco Ezekiel is awake. He looks at her when she enters, looks at her properly, with the eyes of a man who is present, who is tracking, who has not lost the capacity to assess a situation even after what has been done to his body. Almari introduces herself. She explains that she is the lead investigator on the case. She tells him that people have been looking for him since the morning after he disappeared. She tells him, and she chooses this word carefully, because the word matters and she will not trade in false comfort, that he is safe. Marco looks at her for a long moment. Then he asks about Hiraya. Almari tells him that his wife is under formal investigation and subject to a travel prohibition order. She says it directly, without softening, because the truth delivered gently is still the truth and he is owed it. Marco is quiet for a moment. He looks at the window. The glass is dark. There is nothing visible beyond it except the faint reflection of the room. When he speaks again, his voice is still rough but steadier than it was. I knew something was wrong, he says. I kept hoping I was wrong. It is a sentence Almari has heard before, across 9 years of this work, from people who sat with knowledge they could not yet prove in rooms they could not yet leave. She writes it down in her notebook, not because it is evidence but because some things deserve to be recorded simply because they are true, and because the record of this investigation should contain this moment somewhere, in someone's handwriting, so that it is not lost to the abstraction of case file language. The physical report compiled by the attending physician at Al-Khor Hospital over the following 2 days is detailed and grim. Midazolam toxicity from repeated administration over an extended period, consistent with someone being sedated at intervals across multiple weeks. Severe dehydration and moderate malnutrition, indicating limited food and water access across the period of captivity. 2 fractured ribs, sustained at the time of abduction, blunt force, consistent with being struck or compressed during forcible restraint. Significant muscle atrophy from prolonged immobility. A laceration at the posterior base of the skull, healed but still visible, consistent with impact from a rigid object. The wound is approximately 3 weeks old at the time of examination, which places it within the window when Hossein received the Disperse message and the operation began to unravel. The moment, investigators will later conclude, when the plan's contingency collapsed and someone made a decision about what to do with a man they no longer knew how to move. Whoever was responsible for the back room at Ras Abu Fantas had, instead of resolving the problem in the most permanent way, moved Marco to Al-Khor, had paid for 3 weeks of medical care in cash, had given a false name and disappeared. This was not mercy in any clean sense. It was the calculation of people who had understood, at some point in the night of March 4th, that the operation was already exposed enough that the consequences of a body would be categorically worse than the consequences of a survivor. Marco Ezekiel is alive because killing him had become more dangerous than letting him live. He was alive also because Faris al-Saladi eventually chose a consular official over a contract renewal. And because Corazon Ezekiel applied a schoolteacher's practical efficiency to the worst morning of her life. And because Hind Almari is the kind of investigator who reads a camera fault timestamp and underlines it. And because Jocelyn Panganiban sat down in a chair beside a bed and spoke in Tagalog. Dr. Khalid Mansour is arrested at his villa in the Aspire Zone at 6 a.m. on April 8th, 3 days before Marco is found, because warrants do not wait for recoveries and Almari will not give him the window that 3 additional days would provide. He is in the kitchen making coffee when the CID tactical unit enters. He looks at them with the composure of a man who has had enough time, 35 days, to anticipate this moment and decide how he will occupy it. He does not resist. He does not speak. He is placed in the vehicle outside while his wife, Hessa, stands in the kitchen doorway in a robe and watches with an expression that Almari will later describe in her case notes as containing more knowledge than surprise. Mansour says nothing for the first 3 hours of his custody interview. He exercises his right to legal representation and maintains a stillness that belongs to men who have operated in high-pressure environments for decades and who understand that silence is its own form of strategy. Then Almari places a photograph on the table. Not a surveillance photograph. Not a document. A photograph taken at Al-Khor Hospital on the morning of April 11th, with Marco's consent, showing a man in a hospital bed with the specific physical diminishment of someone who has been held in a concrete room for 32 days. She places it on the table and says nothing. She waits. Mansour looks at the photograph for 11 seconds. Then he says, very quietly, "I want to speak with my lawyer about the possibility of a cooperation arrangement." The cooperation arrangement his lawyers propose is not granted in the terms they request. What emerges from the subsequent legal proceedings is a guilty plea entered under sustained evidentiary pressure, covering conspiracy to commit kidnapping, procurement of unlawful restraint, criminal facilitation, and falsification of corporate records. The charge of attempted murder is pursued by the prosecution but not ultimately proven beyond reasonable doubt. The argument that the intent was removal from Qatar rather than death cannot be fully dismantled by the available evidence, and the prosecution declines to proceed on a charge it cannot prove. This is the imprecision of law applied to a situation that has no clean shape. Mansour is sentenced to 18 years. His medical license is permanently revoked. His villa and the assets connected to the shell company network are seized. Marhaba Gulf Logistics FZE is dissolved by court order. Hiraya Ezekiel is charged with criminal facilitation, withholding material evidence, and making a materially false statement in a missing person report. Specifically, the characterization of Marco as unstable and the suggestion of voluntary departure, which the prosecution demonstrates was made with full knowledge of his actual situation. She is sentenced to 4 years. The court determines that she knew the operation was being prepared, provided the triggering information that activated it, but did not have full operational knowledge of its execution or its near-fatal outcome. Whether that distinction provides meaningful moral resolution is not a question the court is designed to answer. It simply records what it can prove. Imtiaz Hossein receives 7 years, reduced in acknowledgement of his cooperation. The IT security supervisor at HMC who cut the parking structure cameras on Mansour's instruction receives a 3-year suspended sentence in exchange for complete testimony. The Bangladeshi freight company director who fled to Karachi is the subject of an Interpol red notice. As of the close of proceedings, he has not returned. Marco Ezekiel spends 6 weeks in medical care. The physical injuries resolve in the expected timeframes. The other injuries do not resolve on any timeline that medicine can predict or promise. Raul Escobar drives to Al-Khor Hospital every 3 days. He does not ask Marco to talk. He brings food from the Filipino grocery, the same online store from which Marco and Hiraya used to order sinigang packets in bulk, and sits with him in the way that old friends sit together when there is nothing useful to say and presence is the only form of help available. Marco returns to the Philippines, not to Qatar, not to the Gulf, which offered him salaries and then offered him a concrete room and then offered him the specific experience of surviving something that was designed to remove him from the world's awareness entirely. He goes back to Batangas, to his mother's house, to a room with walls he has known since childhood. When Corazon Ezekiel opens the door and sees her son standing in the doorway, she does not make a sound. She steps forward. She puts her hands on his face. She pulls him inside. The candle she has been lighting every day since March 4th is still burning on the shelf in the living room. She blows it out that afternoon and does not light it again. The wedding photograph is no longer on Marco's desk. It is no longer anywhere visible in the house. He did not destroy it. He simply placed it somewhere that is not in front of him, which is its own form of decision, made quietly without announcement, in the way that people make decisions about the things they need to stop looking at in order to move forward. Marco does not give interviews. He does not appear publicly. He provides his testimony for the criminal proceedings via video link from Manila. 4 hours, complete and composed. Every question answered without editorial or hesitation. When the prosecutor asks at the end how he is doing, Marco pauses for a long moment. He looks into the camera. "I'm still figuring that out," he says. "But I'm here." Faris Al-Saladi's contract with Gulf Facilities Management is not renewed in July, though not for the reason he had feared. The firm loses the HMC maintenance contract to a competitor in a routine tender cycle, and the non-renewal has nothing to do with what he came forward to say. He finds new employment within 6 weeks, managing facilities at a hotel complex in Lusail. He does not speak publicly about the case. When contacted through an intermediary by a Filipino news outlet, he declines the interview. His response, conveyed in a brief message, says only, "I did what was right. I wish I had done it sooner." 9 words. He does not elaborate. Detective Sergeant Hind Almari continues to work in the Serious Crimes Unit. The Ezekiel investigation is the one her colleagues ask her about most often at training sessions, and she presents it the same way each time, not as a success to be celebrated but as a system to be audited. She talks about the camera timestamp. She talks about the 14 days. She talks about what happened in a hospital ward in Alcor when a nurse sat down beside a bed and spoke in the right language at the right moment. She always ends on the same note. Marco Ezekiel is alive because 3 people decided to be honest when honesty cost them something. A maintenance worker who came forward, a nurse who asked a question, and a man who drove to a hospital at night because he already knew what he would find and could not live with himself if he didn't go. She pauses there, every time to let the weight of it land. The broken street lamp on Alisticle Road, the one beneath which Marco parked on the night of March 3rd, was repaired 11 days after the disappearance as part of a routine municipal maintenance cycle. It now burns steadily through every night, illuminating a stretch of road that looks, to anyone driving past, like every other street in that part of the city. Organized, modern, lit, ordinary on the surface. The way most things look when everything that happened on them happened in the dark, and by the time the light came, the people who were there had already gone somewhere else. Marco Ezekiel went somewhere else. He went home. That is the part that, in the end, is the only part that matters.